Introducing our speaker, Professor Russ Castronovo. I am welcoming him on behalf of the Wright Center for Computation and Just Communities, which is housed within the Newcomb Institute here at Dartmouth. Our particular working group on fake news, propaganda, and narrative force, which was founded by Petra McGillen in the German department, Dan Rockmore in computer science, and myself in Russian, has focused this year on critical information studies, which is the interdisciplinary study of information, everything that may be considered information. And Professor Castronovo struck us as having an exceptional perspective and knowledge on this topic. So we are delighted that he could be here with us. This evening would not have happened without the generous support and wonderful staff of the Wright Center. And so I thank them for making this all possible. Now, Professor Castronovo has written extensively, penetratingly and provocatively on some of the darkest and most controversial themes running through our nation's history and literature. He comes to us from the equally snowy University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is Tom Paine Professor of English and Dorothy Draheim Professor of American Studies. His earlier books on 18th and 19th century America have illuminated the literature and cultural history of slavery and our national genealogies, of death and eroticism in the public sphere in 19th century America, and of propaganda, its material production and dissemination during the Revolutionary War. Oh, and also, not to leave out any of his books, on the aesthetics of democracy and anarchism. This evening, Professor Castronovo will be presenting some of the ideas from his most recent book, entitled American Insecurity and the Origins of Vulnerability, which will be published by Princeton University Press this fall. We were fortunate enough to have Professor Castronovo visit my first-year seminar, which is called Who is the Terrorist? And we had a very intense discussion about what makes us feel safe and why, and what makes us feel threatened, and how data and numbers can do both. But quite aside from hard empirical data, there are soft, more humanistic things, like aesthetics and affect, that create our sense of security, or conversely, our sense of threat, both of which are inextricably related. I am very excited and intrigued to hear more, so I will ask you to help me welcome Professor Castronovo so that he can tell us now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a lovely introduction. No one's ever that nice to me at home. And thank you all for coming. I know it's snowy roads and a tough evening out there. I want to thank others, including Professor Lynn Paddock for the invitation, and to Christine Monagle for helping me get here. It's particularly gratifying to be here and in the presence of colleagues I've had the good fortune of learning from over the years, Colleen Boggs, Don Pease, and my new colleagues that I just met today, right? Petra McGillen and Lynn Paddock. I should say I've lectured in this room a couple times in the past, as I've had the opportunity to visit Dartmouth for several summers running and participate in the Futures of American Studies Institute, a really wonderful Dartmouth institution. But it's also an unfamiliar landscape for me, since I think this is the very first time, hopefully not the last, that a center, the overarching center, the Newcomb Center for Computational Science, reached out to me. So I'm really touched by that. So what I'd like to do this evening is draw a bit from my forthcoming book, American Insecurity and the Origins of Vulnerability, which is essentially about how the project of security, understood variously as national security, information security, psychic security, climate security, racial security, and other similar formulations, is this kind of tangle of contradictions. And what I was discerned in trying to do this book was that security actually depends on fear. It's not the antidote to fear, but it depends on it. And security is, again, not the solution for terror, but is productive of terror. That is, security always has a tendency to devolve into its opposite. The quest for security inevitably leads to feelings of profound vulnerability, and they're often racialized. And ultimately, what we get from security, I think, is an overwhelming sense of insecurity. So although security promises protection from any number of modern threats, from computer viruses to terrorism, it readily raises a host of conceptual, affective, and political problems. Installed on laptops, it's built into the design of architecture of public space, and it's institutionalized in the Department of Homeland Security and the NSA, security measures seem to be everywhere, and security awareness an around-the-clock obligation. Yet omnipresence is not the same thing as omnipotence, right? And certainly not all iterations of security are the same. So accustomed have people become to security that it often takes spectacular failures to remind us of its existence. Even just a potential breach of firewalls, borders, or other safety precautions can prove singularly productive in providing an urgent and ongoing rationale for security. Nonetheless, everyday reminders to update your password or place all metal objects in the bin play an equally vital role by making the habits of security part of the dull background noise of social life. Security is both exceptional and ordinary. Its continuous intrusion in our lives justified by its potential, however improbable, for failure. Without this interplay of acute vulnerability and a vague awareness of dangers, security would seem superfluous, a tiresome encumbrance not worth the anxiety or resources it demands. So security, I would argue then, is a mode of governance and a way of feeling that is always in tension with itself, at odds between its aims and its methods, its presuppositions and its affects. So such a conceptual tangle was the last thing I wanted to encounter when trying to write a book on the topic of security. And I was kind of flummoxed for a while, and then I realized I needed to come up with a series of maxims or propositions to guide me through the book. And there's one particular proposition about information that I want to share with you today. But first, let me race through a couple of the other propositions that precede it to give you a glimpse of how these ideas are staged and sequenced. So the book, in some ways, and Lynn Paddock already kind of mentioned this insight, which I had, but she's had long before me, which is this idea that security is a matter of aesthetics. And what I mean by this is that if you're thinking about security and you're looking at who kind of dominates that discourse, right? It's not humanities types. In fact, it's overseen with a type of military-style realism is how we tend to talk about security. But I wanted to think about the alternate, like why do we need aesthetic discourse, which I'll say more about. Why do we need aesthetic discourse to understand security? Another proposition I had was this idea that security depends on fear. And I worked with some earlier materials, principally Hobbes, to think about this, who talks about there's this notion of continual fear. And for Hobbes, it's all about the creation of Hobbes' writing, all about the creation of the subject, right? And for him, the modern political subject, right, or modern political subjectivity comes from continual fear. And that's kind of like this core insight for me. And then I also, have mentioned this one, which is that security sort of generates insecurity, which creates a pressing need for security, which in turn generates insecurity, and so on, right? There's this loop that we get caught in. And I think we can understand this loop, how it functions, if we go back to some of the etymology of security, because we have the word securitas in Latin, which comes from secura, and it really means like the say, right? The prefix here is without care. So security, secura, is to be without care. But we could also think that to be without care is to be careless, right? And so that's the problem, right? If you're secure, suddenly you're careless, and then you're exposed, right? Then you're vulnerable, then you're insecure. And this, for me, I can just, and this is the type of conundrum that I explore through literature. So like the early American novelist Charles Brockden Brown writes, quote, "We are frequently in most danger when we deem ourselves most safe. Or the Shakespearean variant comes from the goddess Hecate in Macbeth as she plots the downfall of the murderer become king. Quote, "And you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy." So all this is prelude for the proposition I'd like to explore with you this evening. And that's this one. Security requires information, and yet there is never enough information. There is only too much. So the task of identifying dangers and calculating the risks depends on having sufficient information to resolve the uncertainties that make for insecure futures. We do this everywhere, weather forecast, financial markets. This is how we operate. The more information, the better. Computer algorithms, sophisticated probabilistic analysis, and the exponential increase in global information storage capacity in the digital age have stretched this pursuit to an unimaginable extent. Big data, in the parlance of tech gurus, thus relies on what I'm told, or what I learned were the 3 V's: volume, velocity, and variety. In the post-truth era associated with disinformation, some suggest an alternative facts and the scourge of fake news has prompted suggestions to adding veracity and value to the list. So though people in the information and security industry emphasize the positive potential of these attributes, right? It's always good to have information that comes to us quicker. It's always good to have information that is more diverse, right? This is the way they think about it. I think each of these facets have an equal potential to generate insecurity. Velocity, for instance, increases the flow of data to allow for faster delivery of knowledge and quicker response times. But the speed of information can also threaten the stability and continuity of a regime in an era of revolutionary ferment. So for a different project that I did on information warfare and slow media, I had occasion to look at the journals of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, which are horrifying and fascinating, but he's really concerned with speed. He's always writing about like motored to Potsdam at 60 miles an hour, was able to churn out 1,500 leaflets in 20 minutes. He's always interested in celerity because it's so important to information. And so I think velocity, we need to reconsider what does it mean in terms of information. Closer to home, the unchecked velocity of disinformation helped incite a mob of right-wing rioters to attempt a coup on January 6th by storming the US Capitol, which is not to say that they were Nazis, or at least not all of them were Nazis. The actual content of the conspiracies and lies about a stolen election were only as important as the speed at which they spread on QAnon, Parler, and Twitter. So what happens, I think, is that the volume of information, this would be the next V, places an infinite amount of data within our reach, within our keyboards. But it's the superabundance that also stokes affective unease. Here's where the aesthetic matters. And as we'll see, the overload of information is connected to the unhinging, disoriented, ego-crushing effects of the aesthetic experience known as the sublime. Acquiring more information about an impending or imagined danger, whether in the shape of an approaching storm system or rumors of terrorist attack, is seen as essential to citizen safety and national security, as it should be. Too little information, however, jeopardizes our ability to mount an effective response and meet the threat before it fully materializes. But too much information presents a corollary problem, generating insecurity from our gargantuan data set that can never be fully processed or understood. And we could also just want to note here the environmental cost of this, right? The tremendous energy suck of storing all this data with the resources of the earth. The burden of finding enough storage is one thing, but remaining composed in the face of too many scenarios and too much intel is another, one that presents cognitive hurdles to the intelligence community attempting to track and make meaning out of the vast volume of data it amasses. The problem of textual abundance, as Maurice Lee suggests in a really fine book called Overwhelmed, has long been an occupational hazard for readers and critics. So the conundrum I'm talking about is not particular to the era of supercomputing. With the advent of statistics and political economy in the 18th century, the amount of biopolitical information that came to be studied as a population indicated both the range of the state's resources and the forms of life that could overrun society's capacity for order. And we could talk about how this data set was frequently racialized, and still is. While a voluminous amount of data offers the capacity and opportunity to discern patterns and tendencies, it also has the potential to flood the senses to the point where sorting, organizing, and classifying becomes impossible. So Don DeLillo in the novel Cosmopolis, and I should, I guess, warn everybody that has a kind of there's a ribbled well, it's a ribbled quotation. So this is what DeLillo writes. Patterns, ratios, indexes, whole maps of information. This is our sweetness and light. It's a fuck-all wonder. So that's DeLillo, and what he's doing here is he's swapping out information for Matthew Arnold's humanistic culture as a source of sweetness and light. DeLillo registers the aesthetic quality of information. The irony, of course, is that information has become so omnipresent and massive that it lacks all the delicacy and restorative power that Arnold associated with culture in its battle with anarchy. Instead, it frequently assumes sublime proportions, whether it is the zettabytes and yottabytes of information vacuumed up and stored by the NSA, or the infinite behaviors, preferences, and interests tracked and predicted by the algorithms of social media behemoths. So I think what we're seeing here is that security's demand for information is insatiable. Yet, efforts to gather and interpret more and more information create the problem of not knowing what to do with all the information. How does one act upon information when there is a glut, when there is so much that patterns can be discerned everywhere and nowhere? Consider the everyday imperative that confronts us in the security line at the airport, the subway platform, or in other spaces. I think what I really just want to say what I like about this signage, I think it's really important. So if you see something, say something. And I don't know if you can see up here in the corner of the first slide in yellow, beneath the subway seat, there's a backpack that's unattended. It's unattended. There's an unattended, it's kind of a black blob, right? So that's this slide, right, where you have a specific but somewhat vague threat, right, that you're supposed to report to the authorities. But this one, now this is the evolution of Homeland Security. This one is just like everything is a threat, right? There's no specific threat. It's just about having security consciousness everywhere in your everyday life, right? That that our life here, as you can see in this street, is out of focus, and we need security techniques, whatever they may be, to bring that life into focus so that we can then begin to report upon it. So this signage that we see here often includes a second injunction to report, right, suspicious activity. But this is really interesting to me here, right? If you see something, say something. Sighted people are always seeing something, right? So what would it mean to take this literally, right? Like I spy, right? What would it mean to take this directive at its word and begin compiling a list of all that we observe at the bus stop or the subway station? Shopping bags, vermin, trash, backpacks, people's faces. The result would be an unending accumulation whose sheer content dwarfs the significance of one unattended backpack. The significance of information is overwhelmed by its ubiquity. Even more disruptive is the possibility that we might see and report other things. If you see something, say something. Crumbling bridges and roads, homelessness, signs of environmental devastation and climate change. So what would it mean to really see something and say something? The desire to process all that we know and all that we do not know, and to paraphrase Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who I do write about a lot. He's a very interesting figure. And the title of his biography is something like Known Unknowns. And so Rumsfeld talks about these known unknowns. And all that we do not know is outmatched by our cognitive ability to do so. Seeing something and saying something makes security awareness a constant activity that forcefully reminds us of its impossibility. Now, it's not just that there exists an infinite amount of something to see and report. What to do with this trove of data once we have it? Human communication depends ordinarily on the ephemerality of its utterance. As Nicholas Luhmann, philosopher of system theory, muses, if spoken sentences did not disappear, quote, their accumulation would very quickly lead to uncontrolled complexity, that is chaos. Just imagine the noise that would result if spoken words did not fade away but remained audible. I love this. And so advances in global information storage and capacity have realized exactly this fanciful scenario in at least one sense. No email, no text, no digital trace ever fades away, and yet the chaos that comes with aggregating all this stuff remains. With so much information in storage or transactional form, it should not be surprising that what CIA Director Michael Hayden called digital exhaust leaks from the apps that we use. Recent security breaches have exposed how vulnerable information from the private to the personal to the secret to the top secret is to theft. So perhaps then, we should think about adding vulnerability to this list of V's associated with information. If so, the lesson is not merely that information is vulnerable to hacking, espionage, or loss. Rather, the surprising takeaway, I think, is that people are vulnerable to information, which has the potential to feed uncertainty, to overwhelm our capacities, and to heighten insecurity. Efforts to gather intelligence result in too much information, precipitating an encounter with the terror of the sublime. The NSA's informal motto, collect it all, fuels epistemological uncertainty, since what is a person to do with this all should it somehow be amassed? The impossible task of contemporary security is to comprehend and find patterns with the boundless amount of data gleaned from every email, cell phone call, wire transfer, and web search. While this brush with the infinite relies on the supercomputer and the microprocessor, the affective condition of being so overawed that condition and reason are derailed is not merely a technological matter. It is shaped by an aesthetic crucible, the disoriented, terrifying, subject-splitting encounter with the sublime. Which is to say that what we currently think about contemporary security is just as much a matter about what we feel about security. And what's more, what we often feel about security contradictorily is a profound sense of unease. So how are we to process in narrative form, right? This is the key thing about narrative, right? How are we to process in narrative form the massive volume of keystrokes logged by the NSA, the National Endowment of the Arts logging our keystrokes, by the NSA and other intelligence gathering agencies? The director of the RAND Corporation's Center for Global Risk and Security, Gregory Treverton, writes that intelligence is ultimately storytelling. Such a statement might tempt us to conclude that people who work with and think about narratives have more to contribute to understanding the war on terror than previously thought. Treverton offers this dictum to explain how the game of national intelligence has fundamentally changed ever since relatively stable models of interpretation associated with the Cold War gave way to the uncertainties of global terrorism. Whereas it had once been possible to narrate stories about state actors, non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda represent something of a black box for storytelling and interpretation. The problem today is that coherent stories with discernible actors can no longer be told. At a time when the US spends more than $40 billion a year on counterterrorism, the challenge is not to collect enough information. Instead, as governments around the world struggle with a glut of information, the task is to assemble the data hauled in by surveillance operations into usable narratives that can inform foreign policy approaches and guide future interventions both at home and abroad. Compounding the difficulties of telling stories about decentralized networks, states have determined that they must also keep tabs on millions of their own citizens. While figures such as Michael Chertoff, former head of Homeland Security, fretted that over the rise of, quote, ungoverned space, it is worthwhile remembering that Chertoff co-authored the Patriot Act, giving surveillance agencies broad latitude to gather information about US domestic populations. It is not just that another inexhaustible supply of information needs to be monitored, but also that the raw data has to be made into patterns and narrated in order to attain the status of useful intelligence. Chertoff's recommendation that security agencies be empowered, quote, with as many tools as possible to be applied overseas and at home, unquote, heightens the problem, since the unimaginable expanse of information is itself the problem. As Matthew Podolsky neatly suggests, quote, big data has replaced Big Brother, unquote, leaving intelligence experts, security analysts, and other storytellers, quote, drowning in seas of information that not even most sophisticated algorithms can sort, unquote. The crisis is at core effective and aesthetic, as the surfeit of information appears as a source of sublime terror. So security and surveillance always seek more, only to find that there can never be enough. And this is Treverton again. He writes, quote, at present, US collection produces too much data. The sheer volume of the data or take from collection, just from intelligence's own secret sources, threaten to overwhelm the processing of it, unquote. Intelligence gathering, in effect, creates its own knowledge deficits. Even criminologists like Neil Loder and Ian Walker, who see security as a thick public good, recognize that security often becomes an obsession that can never achieve its task of controlling for every possibility. Knowing that there's always more to know, the project of security confronts, and this is this book in back of me, is that security confronts an infinite and ever disappearing horizon of possibility, unquote, that ironically makes security a source of apprehension and doubt. As the security apparatus tracks more and more things, letters in the 18th and 19th centuries, telephone calls and wireless transmissions in the 20th, digital footprints and biometric data in the 21st, it gives rise to a dizzying awareness that there are an infinite number of things to keep tabs on. The coordination of observation, data, and intelligence surely provides increased knowledge about the world and ourselves. But the catch is that the mission to produce, assemble, and most importantly for my purposes here, understand and convey information results in anxious awareness that this mission can never cease. Security can do no other than generate insecurity. So faced with the prospect of too much data and too little story, we begin to confront information as a sort of sublime overload. Even proponents of surveillance and data collection, such as Walker and Loder here, admit that security, quote, exists as a condition beyond our grasp that appears endlessly to require more security resources, unquote. The infinite amount of data that overwhelms our capacities represents more than just a symptom of contemporary intelligence gathering. It also suggests a problem of perception, cognition, and imagination that tracks back to 18th century theories of the sublime. Information is more than a technical matter. It is also a philosophical and aesthetic problem whose expansive dimensions indicate that the human need for security cannot be solved by more data, sharper cameras, or faster computers. Long before the accumulation of massive data sets, thinkers such as Kant and Locke thought about the connections between infinite amounts of information and terror, only to discover obscurity and darkness hovering at the fringes of the human desire to know and communicate. The concept that Kant applied to that which staggers our comprehension is the sublime, an affective state often associated with inexpressible terror and fright, but also with exhilaration and transcendence. Rather than parse all the variants of the sublime, there's the Kantian sublime, there's Schiller's two essays on the sublime, there's Burke on the sublime. I want simply to register how security in its drive to amass information and anticipate dangers comes to resemble a sublime pursuit. And what does that mean? But there's a key difference, where in classic accounts, being overawed by the sublime ultimately leads to harmony. The sublime coordinates of security, being overwhelmed in all the ways I've been talking about, being struck dumb, being rendered inexpressible, do not ultimately generate feelings of transcendence. Even though security analysts acknowledge that narrative and storytelling are needed to make sense of a massive volume of intelligence, they do not often think about the aesthetic and why that may matter. Only by considering the corporeal sensorium that is the aesthetic can we begin to understand why security makes people feel powerless. We might think of this experience as an encounter with the informational sublime, in which the amassing of knowledge promises unbounded comprehension while also threatening a cognitive breakdown that arises from the impossible burden of knowing so much. Coming in and out of focus, defying human reason but broadening the imagination, the informational sublime denotes a zone in which the political rationale for security is always shadowed by sensations of terror. Kant postulates that in contrast to beauty, which depends on an external stimulus from flowers and things like that, we make the sublime a function of our own subjectivity as we seek, quote, the sublime merely in ourselves and in our attitude of thought, unquote. When we confront some incomprehensible magnitude, a sort of two-step process ensues in which our imagination runs to infinity and then cleans up the scene by employing math to comprehend it. How sublime, this is like what Kant would say, how sublime is the mind that can ponder a question as eternal as the number of the stars in the heavens, right? Or in a contemporary variant that I prefer, how sublime must it be to cull an endless stream of raw data from global telecommunications? Information might not appear sublime. After all, colloquial usage often aligns it with basic, trivial, straightforward stuff, but its superabundance can prove dizzying. So what Kant called the mathematical sublime outstrips sense and produces a vertiginous encounter of the mind with its own capacity to contemplate infinity. From this perspective, what could keep security experts up at night is that data abundance and information overload appear as threats in their own right, taxing to the extreme any meager human ability to assemble, process, and most crucially, tell a coherent story about an expanse of information so incomprehensible that it can only be understood as sublime. Kant makes the crucial distinction that it is not the colossal object that is astonishing. Rather, it is our own mind coming to grips with the inadequacy of our senses as we try to imagine some staggering infinity. That's the sublime. We do not find pleasure in some object just because it is immense, but we do find, quote, satisfaction in the extension of the imagination by itself to apprehend what is great beyond all comparison, unquote. Unlike the experience of the beautiful that leads to, quote, restful contemplation, the sublime unnerves us. More profound and soul-crushing than the discovery of any specific threat hidden in emails or other data, the terror of sublime intelligence gathering lies precisely in the challenge of imagining all communications that may be captured, as well as the incalculable connections that they create. A glut of information carries the overpowering force of the sublime, but it differs from the philosophical accounts in one crucial respect. Kant's subject achieves, quote, a state of mind that becomes compatible and comfortable with sublime magnitudes. But the intelligence expert finds no cognitive haven. Infinite amounts of data imbue security with the terror of the sublime, but it is a sublime without release or enlightenment. The crisis is narratological. How can experts armed with sophisticated algorithms, let alone ordinary human beings, detect a terrorist plot when there are so many details but no single story? So if the crisis is narratological, and if intelligence is ultimately storytelling, it remains a question of what mode of storytelling might be in play. Here's where I hope a literary critic might contribute to the discussion: the Gothic. The Gothic is a mode obsessed with secret intelligence acquired through whispers, glances, misdirected letters, long-lost manuscripts, and unpredictable encounters with print cultures. And it transposes this, what I've been calling the informational sublime, to narrative form. Often corrupted, frequently deficient, and always lacking transparency, Gothic media stoke an impossible desire to know more, driving characters to incur greater risk and propelling readers to turn page after page. Knowledge is at once promised and withheld by the mainstays of Gothic fiction, secrets and surveillance, that make for emotionally charged storytelling suffused with terror and suspense. Effective intensity reaches such depths that Gothic novels routinely resound with what each subject calls, quote, the despair of the incommunicable, unquote, in ways that recall the sublime's tendency to leave the subject speechless. And if readers can predict the Gothic novel's contents with unnerving certainty, as Sedgwick further suggests, what is certain is that this perilous environment jeopardizes the security of information at every turn. Here's also the point where the literary critic might turn to an extended textual example, taking the details of a single novel as emblematic of a larger constellation. The next move for that critic would be to use the text to extend or perhaps even solve this problem. In effect, discerning in literature a hermeneutic for processing social or political or philosophical complexity, thus saving the day, right? And this is what I usually do. And like many others, I find both interpretive facility and power in this method. But since I'm at a talk that's sponsored by the Newcomb Center on Computational Science, I want to kind of avoid that method and say that and do something else. That is, where in the longer version of things, I would go through a text, an 18th century Gothic novel by American writer Charles Brockden Brown, to persuade you how he renders information and communication into matters of security. That's what I would try to do, and I'll do a little bit of that today. And his novel Wieland certainly does do that. It's all about it's about a serial murder, it's about seduction, it's about acts of self-combustion, it's about stolen diaries, lost letters, suicide, Illuminati conspiracy, and the word of God communicated to man. And in doing all this, it's forever commenting on message transmitters and noise. So what I think the Gothic is giving us, and this is why I think it's useful, it's giving us self-reflexivity. It's allowing us to think about the information that we cannot think about. And yet, Brown's intervention is not technical, but aesthetic. Why does information make human beings feel unsafe and secure? So what a literary reading might do is to show how the Gothic offers a competing account of information theory that casts doubts on the intelligibility of any and all communication. While I'm not going to do exactly this, I do want to stress a takeaway from such an exercise, and that is that the Gothic energies unleashed by the informational sublime upset standards accounts that view public print communications, probably digital communications as well, as paving the way for the diffusion of knowledge and the progressive broadening of political liberty. That is, the Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment with a big capital E. So we might begin to approach such skepticism by rereading one of the signature texts of Enlightenment rationality, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in that book from 1690, Locke writes, quote, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished?" That's his famous image of the unimprinted mind. But this pristine state never exists. It is not just that this white sheet is soon scrawled over with ideas and superstition, but also that in the world of the Gothic, papers are routinely misplaced, forgotten, secreted away, or even worse, read without authorization or consent. Blank paper is always also a medium, even though we rarely talk about it that way. Even more crucially, subject of this bizarre print landscape are unhinged, not by the dearth of information, but its excess. In the Gothic and in the Wieland, this novel, the characters suffer from receiving too many letters. They get distracted by textual variants. They become vulnerable to fervor when they are pelted with information, whether it's obscure religious tracts or unexplained voices. This vulnerability changes how we might understand the communication of information. I imagine that you're all familiar with this famous image from Claude Shannon, which is documenting an information chain, right? This is his mathematical theory of information. And unlike me, you probably understand the complex math behind this schematic. But by showing how massive amounts of information might be quantified, Shannon, quote, single-handedly launched classical information theory. That's according to Scientific American, pioneering developments that are now considered the foundation of every single modern communications essential to everything from email to cell phones. In the words of his recent biographers, quote, every email we have ever sent, every DVD and sound file we have ever played, and every web page we have ever loaded bears a debt to Claude Shannon, unquote. So what Shannon gives us is information theory, and he tends to treat information He does it as a mathematical formula, but he does so as though it is clear and unadulterated at the outset. This attitude dooms characters in Gothic fiction. So when translated, so let me just show you this one thing here. So this is like you have information here. It starts with the information source, and then for what's really important for Shannon is that there's this noise source that you can interrupt, right? Or you can add to the signal, and that's how you can code things and send secret messages by embedding it within noise. When the schema was translated for lay audiences, 2 more boxes got added. There was one here that was called engineering noise, right? Like let's say I have a staticky walkie-talkie, right? That's going to introduce noise. But back here when it meets its receiver, there was also semantic noise that he added to it. Like my message wasn't clear, my words were they lacked clarity, and that would be the other problem, that my message was obscured by my lack of control over semantic devices. And so what's important about this is that I think we know that this idea, especially in the wake of deconstruction, the notion that sending a message, like any linguistic action, might be corrupted by semantic noise from the start is familiar enough to literary critics. From this vantage, the language that is most burdened by noise is also most enriched by it. Literature. Building off Shannon, William Paulson posits that the noise within a message constitutes its literariness. For Paulson, what others might ignore as noise, literary critics treat as, quote, information that can bring us to more subtle forms of understanding because it is the unexpected, unquote. So noise equates to nuance and complexity, revealing new possibilities of meaning that escape not just our attentions, but also the more circumscribed range of meanings that abide social normativity. Notice how in Shannon's theory of communication, semantic noise only comes into play after information leaves its source. The theory of communication that might be adduced from the Gothic is both shorter and less linear. And I think it looks like this. It's just one box with noise. And that is to say that for the Gothic, there may be no outside vectors that corrupt information because it's already distorted at its source. So rather than a linear schema moving along an orderly temporal progression, first a message is sent and then it is received, a Gothic aesthetic suggests that communication is part of a media ecology that is not easily tamed or sequenced. So in that novel that I'm not going to talk about, events in Weiland fit a theory of communication that muddles Shannon's linear diagram by tracking a message from its point of origin to its destination. A Gothic theory of communication, opposed to Shannon's mathematical one, gets rid of the outside noise source that interrupts the message in its transit from its source to its destination. But it does not do away with noise altogether, and instead understands noise as part of the process from the get-go. No hard and fast distinctions between information source and noise source can be made. Noise is always buried deep within information. In this Gothic diagramming of information, no reason explains why people are drawn to text. And just one sentence, if you allow me, from the text from Wieland is, this guy says at one point, quote, some instinct induced me to lay my hand upon a newspaper. It's a scene that is repeated more or less several times in the novel as characters are compulsively drawn to books, diaries, and letters and other information sources without being able to explain why. So information, I think we're seeing, is not about agency or intention, and that's what's scary. As in this example, a hand reaches out for a newspaper, just as in another case, an eye falls upon a book that has been inadvertently left open. Information is something like an automatic nervous stimulus, and that's the aesthetic, right? An aesthetic response, and it lies outside of the realm of certainty and maybe even predictive algorithms. When Shannon's research at Bell Labs was translated for a popular audience, the explanation took shape as an analogy suited to the era's fantasies about gender and technology. This is the popularization. Quote, communication theory is just like a very proper and discreet girl accepting your telegram. She pays no attention to the meaning, whether it be sad or joyous or embarrassing, but she must be prepared to deal with all that come to her desk, unquote. The expectation for a modern communication system is no different. Like this feminine embodiment of discretion, it ought to try to deal with all possible messages, no matter the content, and certainly without gossiping about the content. The girl's femininity makes her the perfect transmitter since her indifference ensures that no noise is added to the message. The subject of this brief example is in no way a Gothic heroine, since she exhibits neither trembling nor desire, remaining unruffled by unpredictability. Her passivity makes her the ideal conduit and nothing more. Neither excited nor paralyzed with fear, she is immune to the Gothic problem of trying to communicate inexpressible terror. But what if this girl were like Clara Wieland, the heroine of Wieland, the first Gothic American novel? And again, I'm not going to talk about this novel, but I am. But the aesthetic intensity of Clara's somatic responses to the information receives, her trembling, her aphasia, and her despair, all challenge Shannon's presentation of information, which in Catherine Hale's words is described as a, quote, as a probability function with no dimensions, no materiality. It is a pattern, it is not a presence. Right? The Gothic heroine shows that it is indeed a presence. That is in place of a mathematical approach to communication. A mode for understanding communication as Gothic is rooted in the suspicion that information is corrupted and unstable at its source and made less secure the more it accumulates and the more it becomes attached to particular embodiments. This decidedly 18th century approach listens for the disturbances within communication systems that are typically ignored as so much noise. While Clara might not exhibit the equanimity and calm of the discreet office girl, she does share with her a profound insight about information. The content of the message is ultimately not as important as the otherwise unnoticeable contrivances and accords that enable communication in a presumably enlightened era. The novel sets about violating the normative behaviors of human understanding according to Locke, in which, quote, the understanding, like the eye, whilst it makes us see and perceive all other things, takes no notice of itself. Charles Brockden Brown, in particular, and the Gothic in general, is obsessed with what happens when the understanding does, in fact, take notice of itself, insinuating a challenge to Locke's investigation of how the mind operates. The path is self-reflexive and dizzying, drawing attention away from the content of information toward the medium of its own conveyance. Media scholars such as Lisa Gittleman and Nicholas Luhmann have suggested that communication depends on our not recognizing the media that facilitate communication. Built into our experience with media, and Gittleman writes, is a, quote, structural amnesia, unquote, that allows us to forget that communication requires an intervening medium such as a letter or a telephone. Of mass media, Luhmann writes, quote, that we have to observe their observing, unquote, in order to overcome the, quote, transcendental illusion that allows them to appear as unfiltered reality. As Catherine Hales points out, quote, the page from the Bell Laboratories journal in which Shannon's equations are printed, unquote, remains a medium in spite of the fact that one effect of Shannon's work has been to sever information from its materially embodied forms. And this is where the Gothic comes into play, for me at least. Clara Wieland is always observing her writing, taking note of her own communication protocols, stepping aside from her narrative to reflect on the paper, pens, and diaries she's using to compose her narrative. I don't have time to lay out examples, but the conclusion is that self-reflexive aesthetics rupture communication systems by reminding us of all the abundant background noise, normally transparent protocols, and unforeseen accidents that we forget in communicating information. So I was going to stop there, but I have this postscript that's going to take 2 minutes, so I think we'll enjoy it. I want to show you a video here. Let me just make sure I'm good on time here. Oh, yeah. Is this cool? Okay, good. So I have this short postscript that is bound up with a vulnerable reading practice, a somewhat ironic coda about why humanities critique is important to understanding information and security. So let's take a look at the 3 Days of a Condor here. And in 3 Days of a Condor, we need to think about this place, which is this is Department 17 of the Central Intelligence Agency, as imagined by the spy thriller 6 Days of the Condor. And when it became a movie, it became 3 Days of Condor. I was thinking, like, what other novels could you have, like, that could become movies? Like A Tale of a City, right? Or things like that that were just like kind of truncated in numbers. But anyways, this is obviously a state intelligence agency, but its purview is culture and aesthetics. So working out of this nondescript front known as the American Literary and Historical Society, Joe Turner, played by Robert Redford, and his fellow intelligence experts keep track of all espionage and related acts recorded in literature. So this is Robert Redford leaving, and this is, you can see here there's a plaque to his side, and this is what it says: the American Literary Historical Society. So it would be, I think it's a disservice to call this a CIA front, because it really is a literary historical society. That is, Turner and his colleagues, what they do every day is they read literature in order to discover potential insights about insecurity, exercising interdisciplinary vigilance over scenarios and ideas that affect Americans' feelings of safety and stability. They're looking for patterns or reading for narratives. The conviction that cultural texts can illuminate the concept of security in new and surprising ways deepens the belief that academic and everyday readers of books, images, and other forms of media have much to contribute to understanding how we think about security. So in the film version, Redford, Joe Turner, puzzles his superiors who could not figure out how a low-level analyst with few tactical skills manages to evade assassination. So I'm going to show you a clip here in a second. And so what's happened just at this point in the movie is that Robert Redford people are trying to kill him, but he keeps killing the assassins. And he's just like a guy who reads books. And it's really crucial to think about why this happens. And it turns out that I think that reading books is an underappreciated skill. And let me just get this big here. And I'll just show you the scene without any more commentary.
Condor shot us both. Evidently, that was the only statement he could make before they took him into the operating room.
And the other man, Barber, he's dead?
Before he hit the ground, Mr. Atwood.
You should add that it was a remarkable shot. Half-inch above his flak jacket.
I thought this guy was...
Wait a minute. Was Condor qualified with a handgun?
2 years military service, Signal Corps. Telephone lineman, long line, switchboard maintenance, 6 months overseas. Separated 9/61, worked at Bell Labs, Communication Research College on the GI Bill.
The question was, Mr. Higgins, is he qualified with a handgun?
No handgun, sir. M1 rifle and carbine. Evidently it was sheer luck. Or else.
Yes?
Or else what, Mr. Higgins?
Miss Condor isn't the man his file says he is.
Then where did he learn evasive moves?
He reads.
What the hell does that mean?
It means, sir, that he reads everything.
I don't understand.
Yes. Very good. Has operations got anything?
Absolutely nothing.
I'll just stop there. So one thing I just want to say is I love the fact that Condor, the code name, he works at the Bell Labs Communication Research Center, the same place where Claude Shannon was having lunch with Alan Turing. So it's nice to think about the three of them meeting up. And so at this point, when the screenplay directs that civilian is about to protest again, but he's cut off, as we can see. What if he were not interrupted? What if the audience heard a provocation about the capacity of reading to destabilize security? Reading everything, like collecting all the data, might create a security crisis of a different scale. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was incredibly fascinating, rich, and I won't say sublime.
Okay.
All right. So we have some time for questions now, comments and questions to Professor Castronovo. So if anyone has anything on the tip of their tongue, there are microphones, 2 microphones, and please flick them on and speak into them because we are recording and this is streaming. So if you stay in your seat and you ask your question from there, it won't be captured. And we'll lack that information, and that would be a bad thing. I'm going to start off, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
Saving
So my question was, what about conspiracy theories? because I thought, there's a great solution to this problem of too much information, not from the point of view of an intelligence professional,
Right.
but from the point of view of your average person out there dealing with this overwhelm of information. So, what about conspiracy theories? Just aesthetically, they are so satisfying, depending on the particular one and who you are. And how do they fit into that security vulnerability paradigm? And yes, you went off to talk, the Gothic, and I think that's fantastic. But the Gothic was a very originally very historically specific genre, and of course we have it remains with us. I don't want to say its revenants or its remnants are with us, but most definitely it's a cultural influence. But I'm thinking now conspiracy theories are such a phenomenon and seem to be a solution or a response to the problem or not the problem, but the phenomenon.
I think that's really perceptive and exactly right. So what conspiracy theory allows us to do is, right, you have this, you have the Warren Commission report, right? And so what you do is, it's like thousands of pages long. So rather than digest all of it, right, you cull the facts from it that you need, right? So it's a way to take that and assemble that into a pattern, or a narrative that gives you the narrative, right? Like I really want the fact that he went to a theater, that Lee Harvey Oswald went to a theater afterwards. Like that's going to be significant. And then I need to know this thing about Jack Ruby in Miami, and I put those together, and then I figure it out, right? So the problem with that, obviously, is just in the way I've narrated that, right? It's just another blinkered view of the world. So I don't want to say that we should become, that we don't need information, right? But the problem is if we're just sorting it in this way, then we're going to just have incomplete information. So it's kind of like this Goldilocks problem in the way. Like the conspiracy theory is like dealing with a bed of information that's way too small, right? And it's going to give you an inaccurate account. And then what that's going to do is the other thing is about conspiracy thing is for a while I was really into I just went into the Kennedy assassination. And I found this great video that was explaining everything. It was like, yes, this makes sense, the Bill trajectory. And then there was part 4 of the video was it all happened because Eisenhower made a pact with these aliens in 1958. So I was completely convinced to this one point. So I think that's also the problem with conspiracy theory, that in and itself, I think, can't stop its own problem of acceleration, right? Which might be a little bit different kind of problem than the sublime, right? Because it might be about related to other media, film, which is always moving really quickly, or mechanization. So I think that's what I would think of about conspiracy, is that it's seized by its own breathless, unfurling, And I always say that for me, conspiracy theory is always very much related to film, and so I think that's it's always generating this speed that we cannot keep up with. Don, do you could.
That was a fascinating talk, Bruce. Thanks a lot. You link this to the nervous system. And your theory of the aesthetic is related to the capacity of the nervous system to constantly be in a feedback loop between securitization and insecurity. And that feedback loop has as its reward a relationship to data that is going to feed and sustain the feedback loop. The Kantian sublime didn't presuppose that there could be an alternative to the human nervous system, to which the human nervous system could develop a passionate attachment, a relationality in which there'd be a kind of pleasure in the constant oscillation between security and insecurity. Is your explanation of the beauty of the sublime establishing a relationship between human nervous systems and what is now called an artificial intelligence that has the potential to do what the human nervous system cannot possibly do, that has processed the excess without necessarily undergoing insecurity. In other words, does the aesthetic of security establish a relationship with a new attachment of the human that would be comparable to the attachment of a fetus in a complex unity?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and a challenging one too. I mean, so if again you're right. You're saying like, well, AI may be able to do what through its processing and rapid able to do computational skills, may be able to process what we can't do, right? But I think there's the problem then of like, well, how would we understand what AI is telling us? Right? What narrative is are we going to take if AI is able to kind of, assimilate and deal with these connections that are happening rapid fire in this feedback loop? Well, how's that going to be explained to me? Right? So I don't think there's any way. I think this. I think we're back to the impossibility of communication. We're back to that cognitive breakdown. So AI may be able to do all this stuff. But we're back, for me at least, to that Gothic landscape of the inexpressible. Like we can't communicate it. And like you can try to tell it to me, but I think it's just, and even if I like understand it, I think it's still going to kind of escape comprehension. I think that's one of the things that is drawing us to AI, right? It's this kind of, it is this kind of like sublime kind of formation of the human. And this is like, I was talking with people last night about like films like Her and then the German movie like I'm Your Man, where we see this kind of actually romantic attachment to AI. And we need to think about like what's going on with that romantic attachment to AI. And what's really important is that like it's always a source of pleasure to start, right? Like Scarlett Johansson's voice in Her, you know me so well, you're the best, right? But then it always kind of like comes apart, or in that case, like kind of overawes us. It becomes too much for us. So I think.
But isn't that precisely the pleasure? That is arriving at a state of cognitive breakdown that then reestablishes the relationship with that which will, with the promise of increased security, at once produce a kind of security that's always provisional.
Right. So just so people couldn't hear that. Or do you want to say that really quickly for our live audience out there?
Yeah. If what you're describing, and one of your wonderful formulations, is that security is simultaneously exceptional, that is the loop,
Right.
and normative, then that description is producing a kind of reward system.
Totally.
And a reward system that requires the possibility of always reaching an excess that has as its problem terror, but its reward
Yes.
the securitization of the terror.
And can I just say there? And that's why we have the security state. Because there's always that, right, we're insecure, but we're always going to be rewarded by the possibility of surveillance, right? If I'm always going to, that's why we have continual funding for this. That's the reward. Like I get
That's why the security state, I mean, psychoanalysts talk about the security state in terms of a maternal attachment. That it is, that one of the ways in which that's why I was interested in your introducing the feminine as some of your major metaphorical linkages in your talk. There's something about
Right.
this environment, security, desecuritization, insecurity,
Right.
that's generating an attachment function that has a kind of fierce set of possibilities and primal fears of losing relation that are always answered by a sudden discovery of a new relation, a
Right.
relationship that is transformed into a new cognition, a new insight, arrival at the kind of constant satiation of this feedback system.
Right, and that's good in one way, right? We want to have new insights. We want to be driven. We don't want to be, right, were we completely secure,
But then
we
what,
would be like
what is it
inert.
that sustains the humanities' relationship to this then? Well, you're in a sense, rescuing the humanities by linking through a very interesting set of relays the place that the Gothic in particular and the literary more generally serves in this function. And it's that I don't quite see maintaining its essential role. And
So you think like the humanities is dropping out, right?
yeah, I don't.
Okay, you know what, I'm going to agree with that, and I think I think what you're pinpointing is exactly right, because this. So you were noting this moment of pleasure, this moment of like, you know, of primal attachment that we find. I mean, so imagine how many people, what percentages or what sectors of the United States would go positively orgasmic in knowing that another $1 billion have been appropriated for security. Right? And so that's the problem, I think, is that the humanities are dropping out, right? I think that's the issue. The more and more resources are getting devoted to this, right? And the pleasure is always about the state, and it's about appropriations, and it's about more and more control and more data, right? And the problem, though, is that I really think that we need the humanities to think about that more. We need the humanities to think about that like, you know, this shouldn't be the source of pleasure. I shouldn't, you know, find pleasure in Ring doorbells on everybody's front porch, right? But people do. I mean, that's like what we, you know, I'm sure, like, you know, I would learn from Tess McNulty that that's a really important, like, component of Twitter, like Ring doorbell feeds, right? But that so I think we need the humanities to kind of figure out these things that we're taking pleasure in, and maybe like to say, like, you know, that's what the humanities told us at core. Like, this is what makes a great tragedy. It adheres to these three things for Aristotle, right? This is why we need the humanities, because it kind of instructs us in how to do pleasure. So I just want the humanities aren't just about like unregulated nervous response. Right? We're not like starfish or things like that. I mean, it's about you know, it's the training that it gives us. It's the cognitive facility to deal with these impulses. So that's why I think the humanities, you know, remain vital here, you know, precisely for those reasons. So I mean, it's a great challenge, and I love your question because it really forces me to articulate, you know, what I believe. So thank you very much. Yeah, I think you have to go to one of the mics or. Oh.
I've got one. It's on even. All right, thanks for the talk. There's a lot to think about, but maybe I'll just focus on one kind of theme. So 2 comments and a question. One is that, so in the Shannon diagram, I mean, and this is related to, there's data, there's information, and there's knowledge, and they're not all the same, even though I wasn't sure if you were using them interchangeably, but I think that, but they are different. And in the Shannon diagram, we're talking about transmitting bits, and bits being changed or not changed with some probability. There are various places where those things can be changed. The thing that's not in that diagram, which I think comes back to a lot of what you're saying, is that there's no place in that diagram for interpretation. This is simply about sending one set of symbols. There's the collection of symbols. We haven't agreed on whether they're the right symbols to encode whatever message it is you wanted to send, but it's just about the symbols going forward, getting to the other end, and we also haven't agreed about how to interpret them, but just that the right symbols get to the right place. So there's interpretation in there, which is different from noise with respect to this, at least with respect to the schematic that Shannon put in place. And then I think, not unrelated to this, and something that I was trying to tease out from what you said, and I'd love to get an elaboration on it. When you said aesthetic, I think of aesthetic in almost a statistical context, because when you have the data, there's a question, so just the data, the pure raw feed. And then there's a question of what you want to forget and what you want to and what you want to pay attention to in the data, which you might call information, but that information is extracted relative to an aesthetic, which is generally some value function on what it is you're trying to take out of the raw feed. So I'm curious to know, I mean, how you how you think about, like, where aesthetic fits into this. So that's my question.
No, those are great
Thanks.
points, and I would say that I try to be careful, although I'm clearly not always careful enough about moving between data, information, and knowledge, right? And I think in working out those formulations, I'm much more influenced by like Locke's essay on human understanding from 1690 than Shannon's paper from 1948, and so. So that's just an answer for that. And in terms of like, where does the aesthetic fit? So here's kind of an interesting tidbit that may or may not be apocryphal. So when Shannon was trying to demonstrate his idea of information theory, he went to his bookshelf and he pulled down a book. Actually, it was by Raymond Chandler. And you know the story, right, about this. So he started to read the book letter by letter to his wife. So the first word's the. So he's like, T, what do you think the next letter is going to be? He's like, H. So he finally gets to the long end of this thing. The first sentence is something like, the brass lamp sat on the edge of the, and then she was able to say, oh, the next word's desk, right? So she had been given enough information to kind of come to that final word, right? And that's how he comes demonstrating like the parceling out of information theory. But what's interesting there is that when the word desk was supposed to appear, it actually provided no information whatsoever because it was already known. And so I think I'm not giving you a full answer to your question, but I think there's something about that moment, about like when we have all the information, it actually is kind of it's kind of unexciting. It's like in a courtroom when somebody goes and takes the stand and we say to them, do you swear the whole truth, nothing but the truth? There's no information that's given in the person's response, right? Because they always say yes. So it's not like, so that question is kind of like meaningless. So I think I'm trying to think about like, well, where are the real pockets of where things like where it matters when like information is actually telling us something rather than we're already getting what is known. Like how does it have the capacity to surprise us? So imagine the end of that sentence: the brass lamp set on the edge of the hippopotamus. Like that would be like something to think about, right? So I think that's what the aesthetic gives us. It's allowing us to think about surprise, the unexpected, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only thing I would comment on is that, actually in what you said, the aesthetic for, I think using it in the way you're using it is that Shannon's decided to frame English in terms of this, anyway, many-step Markov process. And so the aesthetic for the information here is that the model is going to be a Markov model, whatever. Which is just to say that there's some mathematical model that he gave for a language that we've agreed is the aesthetic in this case, whereas one could have provided a different model for language generation, which could have then produced hippopotamus at the end of that sentence, which would have been another kind of aesthetic. So I guess what I'm saying is that different models, whether they're statistical models, mathematical models, are in some sense the quantitative technical analog for aesthetic, or even which I conflate with genre in some way for these narrative constructions, and which was kind of how I was thinking about what you were saying. So I thought that was I think that's an interesting take on it. So thanks.
No, thank you. And I need to talk to you more about that, and just to say, as I.
And you will have the opportunity.
Okay, great.
All right. So I am sorry I have to end this wonderful discussion right now because we have an equally wonderful buffet outside. And so if you haven't had a chance to ask your questions or talk to Professor Castronovo as much as you would like, please stay and help yourself to the food.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.